Welcome, everyone. I usually get to introduce this panel. This is my favorite panel. This is my favorite talk of the whole conference. As you know, I'm an ex-engineer, serial founder, and this is an unabashedly technical conference. At least we hope you think so. We screen all the talks to be like super hardcore and all that good stuff. But this is the least technical talk in the entire conference, and it's always my favorite. But to make it interesting this time, I invited the most technical investors I could find. And we coined a new term. We're calling them engineer angels. So for the purposes of the panel, I want to introduce some really smart, awesome people. These folks were handpicked to be the smartest people I could possibly find. And I'm really happy that they're here. So Shruti Gandhi is a sort of relatively new VC with her own fund, although she's been doing investing for quite a while. Shruti has a CS degree, a master's in CS from Columbia in New York, so we're really glad that she's here. Itamar also has a CS degree. Now he's working at Life360 on the business side, COO or? Chief Business Officer, great. Parker Thompson is here. Parker was formerly an engineer at Pivotal Labs. Then he went to 500 Startups, and now he's at AngelList. Parker's very technical and likes to be very loud on Twitter, so you can find him there. And Jocelyn has a really interesting career as well. She was a VP Eng at VMware. Then she was director of engineering at Facebook. And tell stories about sort of the first days when they started to apply machine learning to the newsfeed at Facebook. So she has really interesting stuff to say. So they're all technical. Now they're very businessy. But they've also all started a company. So in order to let them finish their own introductions, I'm going to ask them to tell us briefly about the first company they started and how that went. Shruti.
Nice try.
So the first company I started was a company called Penseed, based on Harry Potter, where Dumbledore picks out his memory, puts it in a bowl called Penseed, so Harry can look through his past. Same concept with your social data before Facebook Graph. And it was the idea of how do you make sense of your data to help you make better connections and find more insights in your life. That was my company. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so my first one was a complete failure. I had no idea what I'm doing. It was year 2000, everybody was like, oh, you can build a startup and you raise a lot of money and you'll sell it for billions and billions. I was this Israeli kid who just came out of the army with a lot of coding experience, and I was like, I'm gonna nail this. So I built this billing software solution for real estate, not really a data thing, and we actually sold it to the Israeli army. Like we sold, licensing and all that, and we're like, this is amazing. Hired 5 people, built a company. A year later, my biggest and only client called me and said, yeah, nobody's really using this software, so we're not actually gonna pay you. And that's when I had to shut down the company, and actually realized that I don't know a whole lot about startups. So, the beginning of a journey.
I have a somewhat similar story. I started a social, local, mobile startup before that was a good idea, before iPhones, and we were taking OpenWRT routers, if you remember, when you could put your own firmware on Wi-Fi routers, and we're putting them in physical places and trying to create local communities, somewhat akin to what Nextdoor is doing quite well now. And people hated it. It just, like, the technology was immature. You'd get to a cafe and open your laptop, and we'd replace all your browsers with our screen. Like, screw these people. So, amongst other mistakes, people didn't like what we built, and I just kept trying to write code to make them really, if I just write more code, they'll like it. That did not work. So eventually we stopped doing that one. So maybe we can talk a little bit about those sorts of problems.
I do generally subscribe to the belief that code wins arguments, but there are some arguments that cannot win.
Not with users.
Yeah, right, exactly. Only with coworkers. My startup was called actually Datify, but it was a pretty half-baked, like 20-something bucket list startup. Meaning, me and my 3 friends wanted to check founder off our bucket list. And we had the bad timing to do this at the tail end of 2000. So we actually raised money. We raised $1 million like 1 minute before the funding window slammed shut in the dot-com bust. And about 6 months in, our investor came to us and said, listen, you guys are a really talented team, but you don't really have an idea. And so as far as we're concerned, you're failing. And we have this other startup over here that we think has a very good idea, email management and monitoring, but they don't have a quality team. So as far as we're concerned, they're failing. And what we'd really like to do is smash up the two of you together so we have one successful startup instead of two failing startups. Would you go for that? And we kind of looked at the writing on the wall and said, we're just in this to be founders. We have no attachment to our idea. So we said yes, and kind of rebuilt that company from scratch and raised $5 million more and like shipped a bunch of software in 18 months, killed myself, found out what I was capable of when I took the brakes off the train. And at the end of 18 months, it turned out that like, this was a small dollar problem to customers, not a large dollar problem. And we decided to pivot into email disaster recovery. At that point, I felt like I had thoroughly checked founder off my bucket list, and I took off. That company actually had a decent happy ending. 5 years after I left, they were sold to Dell for $150 million. So the investors made their money back, and and I can say that's on my resume. But I spent those 5 years in the early days of VMware, so I feel like I was also better off.
So there you just got some pretty good odds, actually. We asked a panel of 4 people what happened to their first startups. 3 failed, 1 succeeded.
I failed too. I didn't know that's what we were asked. We did it. I was building a consumer product when my whole background was in enterprise, and didn't realize anyone would anyone would pay for this shit, and no one did. Shit, I built.
Consumers don't pay for things.
Exactly. That's what my learning was.
So just to kind of explain the takeaways that we hope that you get from this conversation, obviously, on one hand, these have all been engineers who have started companies, and I think they have a lot to share from the trenches about pitfalls and how to think about that if you're an engineer looking to start your company on your own. But then there's this other subtext, right? We're a data conference, so we might veer into some questions sort of about the future of data, and VCs love to talk about data. And technical people love data because it's a scale problem in the best case. So we'll kind of veer into that and get some of their opinions on that as well, since that's one of our main themes. So guys, one of the things that I realized in my own startup life, especially from an engineer's mentality, is I always want to over-optimize stuff. How do you wean yourself away from building perfectness as an engineer to hopefully having a snowball shot in hell of succeeding as a startup founder?
You have to go read this blog post from the Bolt.vc about the Juicero. Have you guys all read this post? He bought a Juicero machine and he took it apart, reverse engineered it, and describes lovingly. It's like, why does a juice machine cost $700? And he explains to you. So anyway, yes, read that post. It's a huge object lesson in the futility of perfect engineering to solve an unimportant problem.
Yeah, I mean, just riffing on that, I think the problem is you don't know what perfect is, right? The whole, I subscribe to the Steve Blank, Eric Ries definition of a startup. A startup is a organization in search of a business model, right? So you're going in with the premise that you don't know what this solution is and maybe not what the problem is. So I think as an engineer, the bias is to sit in a room and just write more code. And if you're not validating that the things that you're making are good, you just go really fast in the wrong direction. So I find that to be the thing you got to keep in your mind is how do I know this is good? I'm making I'm making the wrong thing perfect.
Or sometimes if you're an engineer, you go really slow in the wrong direction.
That's true too.
I guess that's even worse, right? Because going really slow is not going to get you there most of the time. So I've been seeing this sort of pattern again with a technical co-founder or some technical folks who are running a team and sort of their business counterparts, and it's hard. It's a big challenge. But I think inherently for an engineer, and I'm thinking about also my journey as an engineer, doing more and more engineering stuff, and then moving to the business side. I think it's a journey, right? It's a journey where if you've got the startup sort of mindset mentality, then you get it really quickly. You're like, okay, we're not going to overinvest. No, we're not ready for a rewrite because there's no like ROI for that rewrite because we haven't found a business model yet, right? So, so you sort of learn it quickly because you have that in you. If you don't, and you don't necessarily have the startup bug when you go at it first, then having a good partner on the product side or on the business side, which helps you think through some of those things, especially if that person also has an engineering background, is just awesome, right? So I've been in that situation as a product guy. I'm mostly a product person. Or it's like, really, let's think about this. Are we over-investing, right? And sometimes the answer is no. Hell no. We should double down on this because this is really at our core. So it's a complicated conversation to have, but sometimes you have to have it.
I think, well, I have sort of two things. I actually think data people might be a little better than your average engineer because, or have better instincts for this than the average engineer because none of us would try to build anything with machine learning without running an experiment, right? Like you collect some data, you run an experiment. You collect more data, you run an experiment. You change the parameters, you try different features, you run another experiment. Like you couldn't make any forward progress without experimentation. The same is true with a startup. It's just that your experimental subject has to be real people who might buy your software, like real users, real customers. And if you can get yourself in the mindset like that if I'm not running an experiment, I am not making forward progress. So if I'm not encountering customers, I'm actually not making forward progress. Everything else I do is the illusion of progress, only encounters with customers, making some change in response to that experimental data and trying again. Like that is the only thing that measures progress. And I think that that's actually pretty intuitive to data people. The second thing I would say is like, you can take your sweet time. You can take as much time as you like until you raise money. And it's I think, a little bit like, if you think about when do we put things in the roadmap, like have you ever been trying to build something where there's just tons of technical risk, like you actually need to invent something new, and some project manager comes to you with a little Gantt chart and says like, well, when will it be done? Are you gonna hit milestone 3 for the next sprint? And it's like, I have no idea how long this is gonna take. Like you cannot put a deadline on something that you're inventing. And so for research, you don't put that in the roadmap until you've cracked the technical risk. And at that point, you can estimate how long it's going to take and put it in the roadmap and look at the Gantt charts and use those to sort of sequence things and figure out dependencies. So some things you just shouldn't put in the roadmap. The thing about raising money, that's putting yourself on the roadmap. That's putting yourself on the clock. Or at least spending the money puts you on the clock. So you can take as much time as you like as long as you aren't spending money. As soon as you're spending money, you better be prepared to live and die by encounters, by interaction with customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think data scientists may be a little bit better off in this regard. I think it may also depend on the environment you come out of. If you come out of a mature company that hasn't been in that chaos mode of an early startup, I think it's a real shock to the system because you have a lot of definition in a larger company, even if as an engineer you have a lot of autonomy and you're answering novel questions. There's some structure there. We've got a Facebook feed. We know what our KPIs are. Let's make people do the things that make our numbers better. That's a lot of structure. And in a startup, you don't have those basics. And so it's just a lot. There are many more degrees of freedom. And so you have to get into that mindset of figuring out, is the problem I even thought was real? Mm-hmm. Is it an adjacent problem? Am I even in the right ballpark? And sometimes the answer is just, no, actually, we should just like throw this away and go over here and try something else. I think that's hard because you fall in love with the things you're thinking about. Particularly, you're like, my code, it's so beautiful. Like I've spent so much time on it.
So just out of curiosity, how many folks here have either started a company or are thinking about starting a company? Cool. Anyone looking for a co-founder? Not specifically. Mm-hmm. So I totally agree with much of the sentiment, especially about raising money and being on the clock. Dave McClure said something helpful, I think, about the trajectory of most founders in the money raising thing, which is you sort of go through these steps, right? First of all, it's your own money, or at least your own time. Then it's family money, then it's angel money, then it's seed money. And you have to be a pretty special person to like skip those steps. It happens, but more often than not, you sort of go through this trajectory. And it occurs to me that along that trajectory, you'll also pick up team members. So many investors are not likely to fund single-person companies. YC digs hard into who your founding team is. Oh, and how did you meet them? How long have you worked with that person? So there's so much stuff that can happen in the team. Let's talk about team for a second. Do you guys see is there any common advice that you give engineer founders looking to find co-founders, or how do you coach them sort of on complementary skills from a team perspective? Any common advice there?
The things I invest in are very straightforward. It's B2B, so usually the buyer is a company, and the company is in a particular vertical, which means that you have to know what your buyer is interested in buying. So oftentimes when I do look at teams, I like a technical founding team, but I also like if they come from that sector and know how to sell to that sector for whatever problem they're solving. So it is important for me, in the kinds of things I invest in at Array, to have that focus of expertise in some of it. You don't have to be at that company for 10 years, but you have to know how to make and convert those folks you're selling things to as customers fast.
Mm-hmm.
So I do not discount in any way the role of technical founders and technical folks in a startup. And it really depends on the startup sort of DNA and what you need to succeed in the vertical that you're playing at. But to be honest, I am more focused on the business side, right? So I want to make sure that, okay, we can build this system, you guys can build this system, you're complementary to each other as founders, and you have the capability to really make that happen. But for me, it's really making sure that the business plan sticks. So I like a lot to see sort of a founding DNA with an engineering counterpart that has some business chops, right? When I see, sort of the CTO, co-founder getting it, like getting the business, maybe being from that space, okay, they actually understand, let's say retail, which is what the company is going at, I get even more excited. But of course, if they can't build it, then, that's a big problem, right?
I tend to ask myself, what is where's the heart of this business when I look at a team? Because sometimes you see team dynamics, you start companies, it's very hard with these people, and often there are breakups. I think at the earliest stage in companies, I also think about the business side. Do you understand the problem? Do you know the customer? And often, actually, the teams that I fund, we have frank conversations maybe with the CEO and say, look, here's where your technical team is at. This is not the team that's going to be with you in 5 years. This is not going to be the leadership, but you have what you need to prove the basic hypothesis, test the basic hypothesis, and get to the next level. And so when I look at a team, and particularly on the technical side, sometimes they're pretty mediocre, and you're like, okay, that's not going to be the bottleneck. Sometimes we have conversations about the gap in their skill set, and I spend a lot of time coaching technical co-founders on where they're going to end up. Some of them really rise to the occasion and end up leading large teams. Some of them find a role as the company grows, that CTO, or maybe not managing the people, or more of a utility player. But for me, as an investor, the question is, can these people prove that this idea creates value for its customers and get to the next level, or especially on the technical side, is this person going to kill this thing? And actually, often with the maturity of the technology today, you can be a Ruby on Rails engineer, no offense to anybody who's a Ruby on Rails engineer, and get pretty dang far before you have a big data problem or a scaling problem or some of these other things. So it's sort of like, do we have in this team what we need to get to, let's just say, making $1 million a year, as an example? And often the answer is yes, even when your co-founder is someone who you wouldn't hire 3 years from now because they're the person crazy enough to go start a company with you.
My angel portfolio probably has 25 or so companies, and I would say at least 3/4 of them, more than half of them, feature an engineer CEO. So I definitely have a bent. I mean, that's who I know, that's my network, but I also have a bent for technical people and product people in the driver's seat. I think the most important thing to have is self-knowledge. A founding team needs to do everything. Like Parker said, you're not in the context of a big company that has structure and rails and anything to depend on at all. So you and your co-founders have only yourselves. And I think the most important ingredient in working with co-founders is actually first to know yourself, to know what is needed out of the entire team, and to be really honest with yourself about what you bring to the table, about what kind of person you're compatible with, and about what completes you. And it's not necessarily about picking the person that you like, but it is about picking the person that you can be productive together with. I would also say, especially in a technical-only founding team, I've definitely seen like the sort of fear of, oh God, we need a business person. Like, it's like don't bring in a co-founder to be your safety blanket business person. Don't be like, well, I'm an engineer and she's an engineer, so we better bring somebody who looks businessy, right? Like that person, if you cannot articulate the way in which every founder is absolutely necessary to the existence of your startup, you will fail without them, they're performing a vital function from day one, then they're not a co-founder. They might be someone that you need to hire in 6 months or 12 months, but they're not a co-founder. And so like hiring somebody whose past experience is like biz dev, you probably don't need a biz dev person. You don't need a biz dev person on day one. You don't need anybody who cannot contribute to ideation, to creating, to the sort of Eric Ries, you aren't a company. Don't fall into the trap of thinking you're a company. You are a team attempting to discover a potential market and a potential product market fit. And so every member of the founding team has to be essential to that. So don't hire that safety blanket business person.
I made that mistake personally. I need somebody who has some business experience, and this person was useless, and we argued about things, and it just wasn't useful. And this is where when you build something, you find investors, they should be able to help you, and you should be able to do. You may not be the best salesperson ever, but you should be able to go talk to your customers, and that actually is sales, right? It's not tricking them into buying something, it's helping them solve their problems, and I think that's where engineers psych themselves. They're like, I don't know how to sell things. It's like, well, you just go solve problems. That's what you do, right? That's why you started this company, and so getting in there with customers, like you find you can do the job actually that a real salesperson can't do. They actually suck at the thing that you end up needing to do to get to the point where you can even hire them and make them useful. So I think that's a great point.
Maybe there's a stepping stone for engineers who currently have jobs, instead of just quitting cold turkey and starting that first company, which, I like to put pressure on myself, so that's what I did. That was a long time ago, and it hurt so bad. Parker, weren't you an engineer at Pivotal before you went into BD? What did that look like? How were you inspired to do that? And was that a fruitful
we
sort
were a
of
whole
pursuit?
company of engineers, and we just got too big to all be engineers. And so I was like, hey, it seems like this is a thing that we should do. And our culture was such that we weren't going to reach out and hire someone. It was better to have me, who might not have been the perfect salesperson, step into that role than to go hire someone who's a slick salesperson and try to teach them about our culture. In fact, that was a big challenge for us when we sold the company to EMC, which is about the opposite end of the spectrum from a startup, and working through that integration with real salespeople was quite an interesting experience. So that worked for us. I don't know that was necessarily the way that I would advise startups all the time to do it, but I do think in general, if you can take people inside and help them grow and put them into roles where they can be successful, that's often better than just hiring someone off the shelf and plugging them in.
Great. And how have you guys seen your past experience sort of coming to bear with your current portfolios? You probably all have different and favorite ways of working with teams at the early stage. Like, what does that look like, and what do you think you're able to help engineers with specifically, based on sort of how we've set up this conversation so far?
So again, Array is focused around helping companies get their second wave of customers, which is, once your question earlier was, do you go cold turkey or what? But actually, my advice is often like, if you have a dying idea, before you leave, go talk to some of your friends who might buy your product, the hypothetical product you have, and see if they will pay for that down the road, and how much. That's before you even write any line of code. And that takes like some dinner conversation. It doesn't take that long. Then you do your market research, find your competitor, all that stuff. But when you do leave your job and then start and write code and all that stuff, make sure your friends buy that, right? But then how do you go beyond your network to have your other wave of customers come and buy your product after that? Well, where do you even get those people? So that's what Array's focused on. And the network I've built over the years for being in corporate for over 14 years has given me that edge to be able to bring that even from the diligence stage. So when I'm looking at a company, the things I bring to the diligence is like, hey, I have a founder or a company who might be able to buy your product down the road, and let's talk to them from day one. And we've chatted about that a few times, and so it's been helpful. My past experience has been definitely helpful in what I do now.
So I think I could be sitting here and saying how awesome and helpful I am to an engineering founder, but the reality is I'm probably not as awesome and helpful there. Sometimes, so I have a little bit over 50 portfolio companies in general, between people that I've helped in the past, people that I've invested in directly, and advisory roles and all sorts of things. So I've been going through this a lot. And sometimes I can be helpful as a product guy, coming in and sort of helping a little bit to think about the interaction between product and engineering. Sometimes it's helpful, right? But I do find myself spend most of the time focusing on business stuff. Now, what I really love, and I'm not getting us back to the previous question, but I really love to work alongside, people that are truly multidisciplinary, right? The technical co-founders that get me excited are people that are amazing engineers, but at the same time they get the business and they can also do pre-sales. And I mean, those are the people that usually end up being very successful at startups because, like Jocelyn said, they can do a lot of different things, and that's what you need early on. So when I get connected to that founding team that has that, I usually find that common language with the person who's more of an engineer, and I can help them as they think through business stuff or other types of things that are going to accelerate them. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you folks look at starting companies, you're not going to have technical problems, and that's a good thing, right? You're going to be focused on this business stuff. I tend to invest more in business model innovation as opposed to deep tech innovation. So biases through that lens if you're solving a technical problem where the buyer is obvious, that this maybe doesn't apply. But I think what people are not prepared for when they start companies is how lonely it is and hard it is. And so, when you're an investor and you're trying to win a deal, you're not like, look, you can call me and I'm not going to judge you and I'll help you and listen. But that ends up being a lot of where I end up spending time is just, you can call me. I'm not in there with your co-founder and there with your customers. Let me help create frameworks for you to make decisions that are challenging you, and then just listen to you when you need to talk through whatever's happening. And then I tell them, look, concretely, my job is to help you with the stuff I'm an expert in my industry, so help you raise money, help you think through fundraising strategy, help you with all of these things early, and then we'll switch modes once you hit this product market fit and start scaling, and now you need to hire an engineering and product team. A lot of the teams that I work with have not hired 10 or 20 engineers, and so I now have a standing call with one of my teams that I invested in maybe 3 years ago now that's worth a couple $100 million, and they're like, we've got 30 engineers and we're trying to figure out how to make this machine work, right? And it's like, great, well now I actually have a useful concrete skill that I can give to you. That's a team where the engineers are pretty good. Maybe you'd hire those people, maybe you wouldn't. But that's now become the bottleneck. So early, that's, I think, as an engineer, what you're not prepared for is you're not the bottleneck unless you're really, really bad. So it's getting those muscles going to learn all the skills you need to complement your engineering expertise. And I think maybe you said being self-aware about that, right? So I try to help people understand what the benchmarks are going to be, how they're going to be judged, connect them to things so that they can focus on building their business, and I can be the expert in VC.
some people become angel investors just kind of gradually and organically, like someone they know starts a company and they're like, oh yeah, count me in or whatever. I sort of jumped into it full speed. I quit my job at Facebook and like in my goodbye email I wrote, I'm up to be a full-time angel investor. And so like I wanted to go from 0 to 60. I interviewed every founder I knew. I asked them, who was your most valuable angel and what did they do? What was it that they did that was most valuable? And the answer was basically therapy. The angel is the one person, they're not an investor who sits on your board, who's basically your boss, and you have to like, you know, like you should be very open, you can be transparent and honest with your investors, and you can tell them the things you're worried about, but like in the back of your head is always like, you know, this person owns my fate, controls my destiny. And your employees and your co-founders, it's also deep intimate connection, you're all in the trenches together, but ultimately you're the founder CEO, all eyes are on you, you know, if you sneeze, they get a cold. And so the angel is the one person who's sort of like completely outside that framework and who you can just be honest with when you're feeling like totally crappy. Or you can if you have an angel with that kind of a relationship. And that was universally the answer I got from founders that they valued the most. And, you know, and yeah, I got product strategy advice and business advice, and they introduced some customers, and they introduced some people I could hire, and they helped me with interviewing. Like, I do all those things, but it turns out therapy, and my own experience now, sort of 2.5 years later, which I'm nowhere near the end game of being able to say, you know, that I succeeded at it, but I can say that the founders, I think, who really valued, who valued what I gave them the most was when we had that kind of, could have that kind of therapy relationship. I also want to, this wasn't the question, but I want to pick up on one thing Shruti said and see if it, she said, you know, hey, before you quit your job to start a company, like call up some friends you have who might buy it. And, you know, if you're like me, like you might be sitting there in the audience going like, I don't have any friends who might buy my software. Like I'm thinking of making software for lawyers. Like I don't know any lawyers. Like, you know, what am I supposed to do if I don't have friends who might buy my software? The answer is don't found that startup.
Yeah.
Like if you literally know nobody who's a potential customer, like for what you might build, then you are not in the right line of business. You should be solving a problem that you are passionate about and knowledgeable about, and that hopefully means that if you are not yourself a potential customer of the product, like that you at least know a lot of them.
Yeah, or minimally don't raise money. I mean, you were talking
Sure,
about the
yes.
clock
Go
searching
meet a lot
raise
of them.
money. I had a great call with someone the other day who I sort of knew socially, who's like, I want to get into the real estate business and do this crazy real estate startup. And it's kind of an interesting idea. And he said, very self-aware person, he's like, look, I'm actually just going to go run this like a small business and try to do transactions. So we're having a theoretical conversation, but he's very aware to be like, look, let me go just try this, see if anybody wants to buy this thing, and then if I can do that, then I can figure out if it's worth turning into a company. And usually the answer is no, but you fail cheaply, right?
Yeah.
You do it quickly, you do it on the side. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you got to jump all the way in. But I think that's actually a really intelligent and thoughtful way to do it, as opposed to saying, you know what, I want to start a startup, and so I'm going to pick an idea and I'm going to go do it. That just never ends well.
So this is how VCs sound when they pass on a deal, right? It's like, don't start that company.
Well, there's always this.
That's how engineer VCs sound anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
I might not have caught on to the lingo yet.
Well, I think the thing that I went through it myself. So it's one of those things when you're at a company, and I call it the agitation when you're in that company, when you want to solve problems, and oftentimes they're personal because you're an engineer and you're using software that you don't like, and you know you want to find better software because in your personal time you're using Facebook and things like that are actually pretty and good, and then you're forced to use like VM systems and old things that are bad. So then you go and maybe solve some of that which you're used to, or the other side of the thing is you're just like passionate about something, like it could be, I don't know, makeup, or you just had a child and you are passionate about that problem, but you don't know anything about that problem as a business. And that's where I think the difference is. My problem at that time was when I started Pensy was, oh, I like to talk to a lot of folks. I just don't think there's a good, you know, CRM out there for me. And I didn't even know the word, by the way, CRM at the time. So that's the problem. And I was going blind, doing something, building something, and my co-founder and I were friends from my master's degrees days at Columbia. So we just kind of were like really passionate about this, and we're like, of course, this has a problem that people have to solve, but there was no path to having someone pay for that, or a path to like making, like calling friends and saying, would you buy this? And so that's a problem. Those links that were missing in the middle are the links that I think I tell a lot of the founders who are trying to be new founders to go solve that before you go raise money or.
This is actually where knowing somebody who does some investing is really helpful, actually, because knowing somebody who looks at 1,000 companies a year, that's a superpower. It's somewhat useless for anything real, but like, you're like, oh, you're trying to do this thing in this industry. Let me give you 5 examples, and let me introduce you to 3 people who know some things about that. And you can actually learn a lot about business models and things that work, and how to make a viable business. And you often might hear a bunch of people tell you no and decide they're all wrong, and that's okay. But you can learn pretty cheaply.
Well, now that we know that being an engineer founder is all sunshine, we touched
There's a reason
on.
we need therapy.
And we need therapists, or at least life coaches, which is sort of the going term du jour. We touched on sort of some unique advantages that folks in the data space might have in their companies. How should a startup, sort of in the current era, think of data? Is it a defensibility play? Is it something you only acquire if you're successful through data exhaust? Is it something you should go out and try and find unique sources to get a competitive advantage early on? Like, are there any rules of thumb in the way a small company should think about sort of the advantage of data?
I think there are few sources of genuine competitive advantage for startups in this day and age. I think that it has become so much easier and so much cheaper to create a basic web app, a basic mobile app, a product insight or a business model insight, is a competitive advantage only for as long as it takes for other people to realize it's successful and copy it. So I think from day one, competition should not necessarily be your first focus as a founder, but comparative advantage should be. Because if you're building something that's easy to build, for 2 reasons. One, if you really have discovered something novel and it's awesome, other people are going to follow you as soon as that's clear. And large people who are much bigger than you and will snuff you out. But also, it should give you pause on whether what you're trying to create really is insanely valuable if it's pretty easy to build and nobody has done it. So your goal should be to build something as hard as possible to explain why nobody else has built it, or that it's only just now possible, so that you can be confident that you really are building something quite valuable, but not something that just anybody could have done at any point in the last 5 years.
I mean, I would say trying to build easy things that solve the way you create value is solving a real problem, and sometimes you can do that with the most trivial technology, and that's okay.
But the world is not full of dumb people. If there are
true.
trivial solutions to hard problems are rare.
It's true. I think with respect to data, though, I think we have this problem today, which reminds me of like the sort of like when Facebook was really coming up and everybody's like, I'm building a platform. It's like, no, you're not. You're building a Ruby on Rails app with an API that no one's going to use because you have no customers, right? You can sort of say like, I'm building a data mode. It's like, well, no, you're not. Like, you need to build something that customers get value from, that results in a data set that creates a competitive advantage. And so I think the challenge of being a data scientist, you guys have like the most in-demand skill, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem is that the skill is most useful after you solve this really hard problem in an early stage startup. So you guys just are crazy to start companies because your comparative advantage is coming into a company later where you create all this value. So it's okay to do irrational things, but you've got to get the first things right before you can go and get the data to go get the second things right. So I think that ends up being.
I mean, I agree with you, but I think that you can absolutely bootstrap your way to a large data set very, very early, right? And I think that is, if I come full circle on where I was going, it's that what makes you believe that you alone can solve this problem? And if you are looking at a world where you are going to be able to acquire a large amount of proprietary data that nobody else can acquire, you may be really onto something. And it may be that the way to acquire that data is to just go have a ton of customers. Like Salesforce has tons and tons of customers, so now they have a data exhaust and they should be able to do something really, really interesting with it. Facebook, I think, really did not start to exploit its data network effects until 2010 and beyond. I mean, I think it was really just hitting its stride, and it was first had to do something else of value before it got all these users, and then it noticed that it had this huge data asset and maybe it should do something. But I do think there are ways to bootstrap that, whether it's with public data sets, whether it's with partnerships, whether it's with research, whether it's with the right kind of partnerships. I'm thinking Idemar is an investor in a company called Pacer, which is a really fascinating way of acquiring large data sets fast. I don't know if you want to say more about them.
Sure. By the way, so
Shruti's an investor too. Yes.
We're both
two investors in Pacer. So like.
So is Parker.
I may
Oh, are you in it too? Okay.
Angel list, yeah.
So all I will say is, if you have,
Are you?
if your idea involves a unique and proprietary data set or a unique way of combining and drawing value from public data sets, you may be really onto something.
So I don't think we're disagreeing in that.
Yeah.
I think if you're saying, hey, let's take a public data set, which definitionally is not defensible, right?
Correct.
I could take it, you could take it.
Yep.
But you have the data science skills to take that, as Pacer, it's taking the legal data stuff. No,
Geospatial,
different?
but it doesn't matter, yeah.
I know a different company called Pacer.
Placer.
Placer, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Pacer, yeah.
My bad.
So you could use this
Non-investor.
technology to go and do something useful, but I think people sometimes get the order of operations wrong on that.
Yes.
So it's like, think about the future, because if you show up at Zeta and you ask, hey, will you invest in my company? They're going to be thinking about what your data mode is 5 years from now.
Yep.
They're probably not going to be asking you, well, could anybody else build it today? Because then they'd never invest in anything, right?
You would hope not, but
I mean, I would look at it two ways. Think about it a lot because I feel like I'm on par with the good data is just with bigger companies now. And so it's harder to start a company with a differentiation now. So what do you do? And my thinking around that is the one thing we covered here, which is create partnerships. But who wants to partner with a company, the new company that's just coming off the ground? But I've seen folks do that in creative ways. If you have something to offer, people will, and if they're not thinking about their data uniquely, which is rare these days, but maybe you can find some way to do it, like legal data or things that are unique. The second way is creating your own data, and that's harder, and that doesn't happen right away, but it's a path to thinking about your company in a way that is, even if you're like an events platform or something else, if I have this data and if I have these vendors and all sorts of other folks using my platform in the ideal scenario, this is the kind of thing I will create, and not 5 years from now, but like even in 6 months, because the value of what I'm offering in return for the data that gets created is going to be awesome. And so in the old school days, that's switching costs and whatever all that is, but that's another way I look at data. But it's true, like right now, data or anything to differentiate yourself is very hard. You better be very passionate about what you're doing and just go at it in a very different go-to-market way to make business more viable and for customers to pay you for it.
So I think this one is really tough. Look, I probably, like 90% of the investment deals that I see, the founders are trying to pitch me some story about we're going to have this data. We're going to have this Exos data, and it's going to be worth so much money. And I'm like, guys, this is awesome, but the reality is it's not that easy. And a lot of people have access to this data set, and even if you can create a proprietary data set, if you're pitching that this is going to be so valuable, show me that value, because a lot of proprietary data sets don't really have that value, and they don't really have a market that you can sell that data. You can leverage that data to create a lot of opportunity. So I think, and sometimes I see companies focused on building tools to crunch, process, distribute data, right? I'm an investor in a bunch of companies that use data in personalization and online advertising and stuff like that. And I know how value can be created by exchanging data there. But the truth is, for the vast majority of startups, having data is not a value prop, right? And it's not going to.
It's just not a possibility.
Well, and you may not know what the data is going to be. I think if you don't know what the problem is you're ultimately going to solve for the customer, you don't know what the data is that's going to fall out of that. And if you don't know what data you're going to have, you can't really talk about how much value you can create out of it. So that becomes an emergent property of solving the customer's problem. So I personally, early, I think. By the Series A, you kind of have these things figured out, generally speaking. You're like, look, we've got this big data set. We're solving a customer. Like I have a company I just invested in that's got a phenomenal data set. 3 years ago, when they started this thing, they were still working with the same customer trying to solve problems, but they would have had no idea that the data set that they've created today would have been something that would have fallen out of solving the problem that they ultimately found. So they ended up with something valuable. They couldn't have gone into Zeta and pitched that 3 years ago at the seed. So I think that ends up being challenging as well. Sometimes you don't know where you're going to end up on these things.
Yeah, it often ends up being sort of a secondary sort of revenue line for a company that's more mature versus this is the primary thing that we do.
I mean, Google, by the way, is the classic example of this, right? Like, who would have thought that they would have invented the best advertising model of all time, being people who hated advertising? Just, they built a great product, and then one day they were like, let's just put ads right here.
Yeah, it seems like often data is the byproduct of having a certain amount of success at solving a customer problem. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but you have to focus on solving a customer's problem first. If you somehow have access to a novel data set that you can use to do that, fine, but those opportunities are becoming increasingly rare, it seems. More often than not, it's the data exhaust that's thrown off by successful traction that actually becomes, it's a byproduct of success at the first step, it seems to me.
I would say for folks here who work with a lot of data, think of yourself as a buyer. And if you are encountering problems that are stopping you from making from increasing your efficiency or productivity in all the things you're doing in your job today, and you would be willing to pay for something, a lot of amount, to pay for something that can make your life better and accelerate the company you're working at faster, that's a problem you've uncovered. And then and then you have your peers right here who would buy that too. That's other customers. And then you are positioned to solve a problem and go start a company if you really want to go start a company in that category if no one else is solving that problem. That's one way to look at that, to work in data.
I love your focus on people buying stuff, Shruti.
Very important. Without revenue.
It's a recurring theme,
Yes.
and it's something that needs to be well understood by the audience, because it's super easy to live in your little engineering glass castle and want to build some technical solution to some problem, and really be way too far behind the curve in proving to yourself, let alone investors, that someone will actually pay money for the product.
Just to add to that, I mean, I think something you will find is that, I feel like we are with respect to data science where we were with mobile 10 years ago, where anybody with the skill set can go get a couple $1 million, which is kind of bad in the sense that you're like, well, somebody gave me millions of dollars. I must have a good idea and this must be special. And it's sort of a false positive there, whereas your customers wanting to buy things is actually real. And I think that, that people get caught up in that, right? Like somebody wants to give them money, and that person giving the money is giving money to 30 other people. And it's sort of just like, well, if this doesn't work out, you guys are really smart, we'll sell you and I'll get my money back. So it's a little bit of money for them. It's many years of pain and suffering for you. And so don't, VCs aren't smarter than you. To find the customers and figure it out with them.
We can't end on that note.
VCs are self-aware.
Don't take dumb money.
So let's take a couple questions from the audience. Who has a burning desire to ask a question? Colin. We got one here.
What data sets do you see over the next 3 years as being really interesting if somebody could aggregate them?
So I'm pretty big, and if you check out my investments, I'm pretty bullish on background location data. I know it's not a new thing, but it really is, I believe, the offline cookie, right? It's the best way to represent what actually happens on the ground. We're really, really good at understanding what's happening online, right? People are going to websites, they're clicking, they're using a mobile app. We know how to track all that. We know how to infer and understand what they are up to based on that, but we don't know a whole lot about what's happening on the ground. So that's a really big one that I personally like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think the arrival of IoT, this is not a novel thing to say, but the arrival of IoT means we're getting just absolute floods of sensor data. And so there are these areas that I would say in the past have been data deserts. They've been data starved. Like, we're limited by our human perception and reasoning, and where now we can really bring, machine intelligence to bear on those areas. Agriculture is one that is really interesting to me because we've started to get a lot of penetration with IoT. We're starting to get, soil humidity and temperature and, sort of climate sensors. Those are all out there. But by and large, you're just getting raw data to the farmer to try to make better decisions himself. I think that is like a very clear opportunity to bring machine intelligence to bear. Where else are we starting to have ubiquitous sensors like security cameras? Just sort of cities are starting to have cameras everywhere. Transportation, everybody's thinking about self-driving cars, but just what about better city planning? Because we know where, this is sort of on the location data stuff, but we know where the traffic is, we know where the parking spaces are open, we know where the foot traffic is. Like, can we design cities better because we understand how people are moving through them? I think healthcare, very, very obvious place where all of a sudden we're about to have sort of orders of more magnitude of data. Like, there are millions of MRIs and CT scans like lying around in repositories. Can we suck them in and learn something from them about diagnosing disease? Undoubtedly. So, I think there's insane sources of like untapped, it's just like this crude oil in the ground just waiting to be tapped. That's a terrible analogy, but it's treasure waiting to be mined and refined and turned into something valuable. So,
I mean, I take sort of the everything sucks philosophy on startups. Like, there's problems everywhere. There's problems to be solved everywhere.
Clearly.
Right? Like, it's like you have this great New Yorker cartoon that's like two cavemen sitting there going like, oh, he invented the wheel and he invented fire. There's nothing left, right? It's like there's just problems everywhere,
Yeah.
and I take a very bottoms-up approach. My assumption is this: like, if I can think of the problem, that's not a very interesting problem. What I would like is for you to walk in and blow my mind with something that you figured out that I'd never thought of, and those are the things that get me excited. And so. That can be on the data side. It can also be on the algorithm side. For example, I invested in a company called Numerai that's a really interesting data startup. They use a really interesting kind of encryption to give data scientists the ability to take open data sets and come up with trading algorithms, and then they use those algorithms to trade and pay people out in Bitcoin. So they've got people sitting around the world figuring out how to beat the market. It's like that's just a problem I never would have thought of, and it's not per se a data problem, right? They've solved a data problem to solve a business problem, so they've aggregated all these open data sets and encrypted in such a way that people can play with them. You should all go do this and make a bunch of money. But I would never have thought of that, right? I'm just not out there in the world in the trenches, and I think there was an earlier point made about like finding problems that are relevant to you. That's where you have a comparative advantage over someone else.
Great. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. But if you have more questions, our gentle panelists will be around later, I believe. So thank you, guys. That was a fun conversation. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.